Tihei mauri ora. Kei aku nui, kei aku rahi, tēnei te reo o te wahuriri e ngā ruru nei. E tuku nei i ona mihi, kia tātou e pai nei, whakeke mai ki runga i o tautahi, ki runga o te o tākoro, ke raro o te maru o te pai. Koutou rā, ngā mana, ngā hi koutou ngā hapu kua tau mai, whakeke mai. Huri noa koutou, e pupuri e mauri o tēnei hui, kei aku rangi, kei aku rahi, a tēnā koutou. Ngā hu e whā, toia mai, ngā maramatanga, ngā mōhiotanga, ngā whakakitenga, kei ake te kaupapa te wā, nō reira, i aku nui, i aku mihi, tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou katoa. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great distinction that we are here today to greet you on behalf of our hapu and our iwi, ngai tuahuriri and ngai tahu, to this wonderful occasion for you to test yourself today in terms of your perception where you are in life, particularly with our relationships and our cultures. We are very much fortunate to have such great Māori academics here tonight, and I'm sure that you will be vigorously challenged, but also lovely and enlightened from some of the things that you achieved tonight. So ladies and gentlemen, on that behalf, I welcome you once, I welcome you twice, I welcome you three times on behalf of Ngai Tuahuriri and Ngai Tahu. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Just first of all, welcome Andrew, who will take over the festivities for tonight and guide you through this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please put your hands together for Andrew?
Kia ora mātua Dave. Ki aku rangatira. Ko te hiro o kahu kura te maunga whakamaramaro i ahau. Ko Aotearoa te awa whakaora i ahau. Ko ngā tuahuriri te mana whenua raupi i ahau ni te mihi ki rātou. Ko Andrew Skolta tāku ingoa no rewa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Greetings everyone, and welcome to the Resource Management Law Association Te Kāhui Tūri Tahu Tony Hearn QC Memorial Lecture for 2023, Hoihoi, Conversations Not for the Dinner Table. Now before I go on, some general housekeeping. Obviously this is a non-smoking venue. If you do need to smoke or vape, you need to go outside, and they'll be 10 metres away from the building apparently. The toilets, the closest ones are down the stairs just past the bar. And they're a bit of a rabbit warren, so give yourself a bit of time if you need to get to the toilet. There is also a defibrillator outside the first aid room, which is located to the right of the female toilets downstairs. And the emergency exits, if the alarms are to sound, you should use the nearest available exit. I think there's exits here at the back. No, I thought there was another one too, and another one further down. And obviously if there's an earthquake, we just drop and hold and wait for some instructions from staff. In terms of drinks tonight, which obviously follows on from toilets, There are some complimentary drinks on your table, and obviously you've had your drinks when you first arrived. There is also a bit of a bar tab running at the bar after that, but it won't be extensive or too long, but after that you're going to have to pay your own way. Now, before I move on to introducing the topic for this evening and welcoming our esteemed speakers, it's appropriate that I mention the namesake for the event, Anthony Hearn, QC. Tony Hearn, as he was better known, was known to many here, but having died in 2002, will not be familiar to others. Now, he was a preeminent expert in resource management and planning law and a renowned litigator, and there are many stories about Tony and his cases, and the cases he was involved in, particularly with John Milligan as well. Now, we hold this memorial lecture every 2 years to recognise Tony's significant contribution to resource management law, which included his review of the Town and Country Planning Act for the government in the mid-80s, and that influenced the creation of the Resource Management Act itself. He was also a foundation member of the RMLA. Now, what Tony would have said about the criticisms that have come to be levelled at the RMA over the years can only be speculated, but as for many of us, I think the impact of the near-constant tinkering with the Act and the failure to fully implement its constituent parts from the outset would likely have featured in his response. But equally, there's no doubt he would have also been an active participant in the formulation and the implementation of its successor. Which leads us in a roundabout way to the topic of this evening's hybrid lecture. Now, I'll leave it to the speakers to explain the title a bit more fully when they arrive, but it will be apparent to you that this event promises to be a little different, which we think is fitting in terms of where we currently find ourselves, given the ongoing reform process and the state of flux that we'll likely be in for some time. It is important at such times to reflect on what the products of change might be. This is especially important when considering the cultural components that are a significant part of the reforms and have the potential to herald significant adjustments in how things are or can be done under the new Act. Because while it seems on the surface that many of the functions and procedures that we've become familiar with under the RMA have effectively been rolled over into the new system, there are also some fundamental changes that will need to be more fully understood. Not least the concept of te oranga o te taio itself, and the means of implementing an outcomes-focused approach to incorporating explicit bottom lines. The Select Committee process also resulted in some possible key changes, including upholding te oranga o te taio, the principal purpose of the Act, with all use and development subject to that purpose. However, no change was made to Section 4 of the NBEB, soon to be A perhaps, which provides that all persons exercising powers and performing functions and duties under this Act must give effect to the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. This contrasts, of course, with the requirement of decision makers to take into account the principles under the RMA. But of course, that's not been the only provision under the RMA intended to enable greater tangata whenua involvement and influence in resource management decision making. Such provisions included matters of national importance, the recognition of kaitiakitanga, the potential for co-management of resources and decision-making, and the requirements for consultation and notification. Now, given these and other existing tools, the change of direction to give effect to Te Tiriti means that suggests that the role of tangata whenua, of tikanga, and of mātauranga Māori in decisions on natural resources planning and Okay, that's better. Okay, I'll start that again. So given these and other existing tools, the change of direction to give effect to Te Tiriti suggests that the role of tangata whenua, of tikanga and of mātauranga Māori in decisions on natural resource planning and use has still not delivered on expectations or achieved the outcomes that were intended, which raises the question, why not? The answer, in my view, is possibly twofold. The first part is the absence of a deeper understanding amongst the general population, and many in the profession potentially, of what tikanga and mātauranga Māori entail, and what is offered by incorporating and implementing them in decision making. While the second part is, critically, the capacity and capability of mana whenua to fulfil the roles that they've effectively been required for them to fully participate, an issue that seems to have existed for at least as long as the RMA. Meanwhile, the confirmation of the status and role of tikanga and its relevance in Aotearoa New Zealand law has been a highly visible feature of jurisprudence of our highest courts in recent times. Its application to decision-making on natural resources is both relevant and obvious, but how it should be incorporated raises a plethora of further questions, some of which can make tauiwi uncomfortable. Some of that discomfort comes from the same gap in understanding of the mātauranga that applies or may be relevant. Now, I've experienced such discomfort due simply to not knowing what was expected of me, or the right thing to say, or the way to act in culturally unfamiliar situations. But I've usually found that having and showing a willingness to learn and be amongst people who want to share, who see the value in sharing as not diminishing the values at stake, but rather growing the pool of knowledge, is a great place to start. Given that, and this is promises of repeal notwithstanding, which I note should not actually change the fact of what we're discussing will remain relevant, we are likely to find ourselves having to play a part in giving effect to Te Tiriti. And how will we achieve that strong direction? What part can we as practitioners play in that process? These are tricky questions that hopefully discussion this evening can assist in moving us forward further down the path to better understanding. That won't change the need to also ensure that capacity and capability in cultural matters is growing at the same time, as this will remain a critical element, if not a precondition. Now, these issues and how they can be addressed are part of what motivates our speakers tonight. Dr. Diane Menzies, Dr. Alayna Pakinui Rā, and Mr. Nathan Kappa. Kia ora koutou. I don't intend reciting the bios for our speakers, which were part of the advertising for the event, and detail their areas of experience and roles each have played in promoting higher levels of awareness in cultural matters, and each speaker will be introducing themselves shortly. I do, however, welcome them and extend our gratitude to them for agreeing to take part in this event. The intention of this event is to highlight these issues and just to ask some of the tricky questions, and you will be asked to participate, which we hope you will. We see this as an opportunity to gain insight into where we can move to in our mutual understanding, and to lay down a wero for us all, to ask ourselves how we can be part of the solution to the question of how to better integrate both the law and the law, L-O-R-E, of tikanga and mātauranga Māori into the practice, processes and policies of resource planning and use in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kia ora.
Tau rewa rewa ki te karu nui, tau rewa rewa ki te karu roa, tau rewa rewa, ka whati te tūwātea, te puapua o te tūwātea, ka tere o te tae karu karu e. Ka eke pānuku, ka eke takaroa, whanno, whanno, haramai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. Ko te mea tuatahi, he mihi nui ki ngā mana whenua te takiwā nei. Ngā mana whenua, taku whanauka, tēnā koe mātua Dave, mō tō karakia tīmataka, me tō mihi whakatau o te pōnei. He mihi nui, he mihi aroha, kia koe whanauka, kia koe. Tēnā koe e hoa. Ki te rangi e tū nei, ki te papa e tākoto nei, tēnā kōrua. Ki te tae ao, tēnā koutou, ki ngā manu, ki ngā ika, ki tāwhare mātia, tēnā koutou. Kia kuhoa, tēnā kōrua, nau mai haramai. Kia koutou katoa, nau mai haramai ki tēnei wā huihuinga, mō tēnei kōrero i pānaki, tēnei mahi tinohira. Kia ora everyone, welcome, nau mai haramai. Lovely to see you all this evening. We gather at the moment under ngā whitu, or matariki, a really important time in Te Ao Māori. A time for us to acknowledge the whenua that we stand on, the awa which is flowing next to us, and our atua which are looking over us. It's a time for us to look forward, it's a time for us to look back, it's a time for us to have big, important conversations like what we're going to have here this evening. So manawatia a matariki. Before we kick off, there are a couple of things that we were asked to sort of introduce about the evening. One of those was the topic, or the title of the kōrero that we'll be having this evening. Hoihoi, shh, conversations not for the dinner table. We were being intentionally provocative when we came up with those kupu. We want you to participate in this. Katoa, this is a kōrero for our nation. It is not a kōrero where we will sit here with the answers on behalf of all Māori, all Tauiwi, all tangata Tiriti. It is a conversation for us all to participate in, and so we really hope you'll lean into the evening that is ahead of us. Ko waio, ko auraki me hikororoa ka mauka, ko wakawaiti te awa, ko Puketeraki te papatipu marae. Ko ka waka e toru, ko uruao, ko araituru me taki timu hoki. Ko kaitahu te iwi, ko tahu pōtiki te tipuna, ko au e tūnei, ko Alayna rā tā koe ingoa. Kia ora everybody. For those of you who I don't know, a number of you I do, kia ora WSP whānau. A number of my whanauka are here as well. My name is Alayna rā. I whakapapa to Kaitahu, as well as a number of other iwi from across Aotearoa. But this is my tūranga waiwai, so I welcome you all alongside other members of my whānau to our takiwā, to our rohe, to have these big conversations. By mahi, by day, I have one of those typical very consulting-like titles, which is Indigenous Design Director at WSP, but my mahi is really pursuing justice and equity for Māori through built and natural environment outcomes. Really looking forward to the kōrero. I'm going to hand over to Di to introduce herself and Nathan, and then we'll kick into the evening. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Tēnei te mihi ki nai tuahuriri, ko nai tahu ki tō monga awa wāhi tapu, tēnā ka mihi atu ki a koe. Ko waio, ko manawaru te monga, ko te ārai, te awa, ko harauta me takitimu nā waka, ko Rongowhakaata, kai runga, kai raro, kai roto, kai waho. Ko Diane Menzies Tahu. So my background was forever landscape architecture, but I'm now a researcher, now very interested in heritage, social justice, and research, and working to support rangatahi in increasing their capacity and capability. I'm really looking forward to tonight. I'm hoping that we really stimulate you, that you go away with something to think about rather than a good meal only. So I'm looking forward to meeting people, to hear your kōrero as well, because this is not only about us, it's about everybody engaging. Kia ora.
Kia ora, kia ora Diane. Nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Kia ora there whānau, our RMLA whānau, and our WSP whānau, kia ora tātou. Ko taku maunga o te tiropanga, ko taku awa o Waikato, ko toku kāinga no Tokoroa hau, ko Nathan Kappa toku ingoa, tihei Māori ora. It's my privilege to be here to talk to you all today. I've got a bit of a freshwater and marine science background. I've got a MBA with honours where I looked at third generation iwi and hapu management plans against the backdrop of the new legislative change. I currently travel Aotearoa training our environmental commissioners, and it's a real privilege to be able to do that. And my current role is with WSP as the kaitohu tohu mātua. I think it's also important to mention I'm Scottish. Kia ora. I'm just a normal guy from Tokoroa, just trying to make a difference. And one of the tools in the kiti of that difference is te reo Māori. Tihei Māori ora.
Tēnā koe koroa. Thank you both for introducing yourself. We hope that this can be a light-hearted evening. One of the things that we've spoken about is that I didn't actually know Tony Hearn personally, but that whilst he was always fighting for social justice and those equitable outcomes, he also brought a lightheartedness. So we hope that that continues through in the kōrero tonight as well. These are some pretty heavy topics. So the idea is that we all participate, get involved in the conversation, and use this time and space to lean into some of that and really start to test our thinking and stretch where we think Aotearoa might be heading. So, to explain a little bit about the evening, on each of your tepu, you will see a jar, and in that jar there are some pātai. But just in case you thought you were coming for a relaxing dinner and a glass of wine, you're going to be doing some mahi. So in the jar there are 5 pātai, and there's an extra one that Nathan will mention in a moment. We'll read them out just in case you do end up working sort of with the person next to you and you don't get to hear all of the different parts of the conversation around the table. We'll read them out so you know what is going on. Before we do that, one of the things that we ask of you across the evening is that you're thinking about the tangible actions that might come out of tonight's conversation and how you might make change. And just to keep you on your toes, we're hoping that somebody has a phone or some paper in their bag and you're going to write down a parking lot of actions that we could take forward. And when we get to the end of the evening, we'll do a quick whip around the tables and get some of those whakaaro on how we can all be taking next steps to keep us all accountable once we've finished the lovely dinner and glasses of wine. Before we do go out there, I've written a little note, a scribble on my paper here, about this site, the whenua that we are sort of standing on here today. And I hope my whānau don't mind me mentioning that just ever so briefly. But the reason I do want to note it is because this is a perfect space for a conversation like what we're going to have this evening. Because out here was one of the first places where Māori, where Ngai Tawahuriri, Ngai Tahu, started to trade with settlers. This is one of the landscapes where those first early conversations happened, and when we started to enter into an exchange of knowledge, an exchange of resources. And I tell you what, some of the intentions back then, whilst partially nefarious, they weren't all bad. It was about working together, and somewhere along the line, things have become a bit distorted, and more often than not, they did become more nefarious than they should have been. So, if we've asked for all the blinds to be raised so that you can look out there and you can reflect throughout the evening and just think of what our roles are in taking those next steps forward. But we'll read out the pātai that we've got in front of us, and we might just swivel our chairs around a bit because this is supposed to be pretty casual. It's supposed to be more of a huihuinga and a bit of a kōrero than it is us standing at a lectern and speaking at you. So the first pātai that you'll find in that jar is talking about Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So it asks, where do we want to be as a nation in 2040? So that's 17 years from now, 200 years on from signing Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And what does Te Tiriti o Waitangi actualised look like?
So this is my question, but I just noticed people are pulling their questions out of their jars. So yes, that's what you can do now. And you'll find this question there as well. People think in different ways in different cultures. Culture affects the way we, what we believe, the way we speak, our values. So, how does or how should resource management law reflect those multiple realities? You got it.
Okay, so on your table you also have pātai 3, and it's about mana whenua agency and managing their takiwā and their rohe. And how do we as a nation and how do we as professionals support their capability and capacity to effectively support the nation in navigating the complex environmental challenges that we are currently facing both now and into the future.
Pātai 4 is starting to talk about those future generations that are coming through. So future demographics show that 1 in 3 children that will be born in 2040, and honestly most likely before then because the statistics are actually hitting us a lot earlier, 1 in 3 children born by 2040 will identify as Māori. What will their expectation of resource management law be, given we know that they will have very different values to what we have today in society, and they will have very different needs? They will also be, and this isn't on your notes in your pātai, they will also be holding roles in organisations that are very different to what we've seen historically. They won't be standing with the lollipop stick anymore at the roadwork sites. They will be sitting in leadership and executive roles. They will be governing in the organisations that you work for now. So thinking about what that might start to look like when your workplace starts to transform.
So, question 5. This is short, but maybe not so simple to answer. What do people think mātauranga is? What do you think mātauranga is?
Right, the wild card, the one you can all play with.
It's not in your jar.
It's not in your jar, so if you look for it, it's not there. It's katoa, all of us in this waka together. And the massive legislative shift that we're currently facing, looking at, what does actually giving effect to Te Tiriti actually look like under the new legislative landscape? It's quite a good big question, that one. And that's why it's going to take the diversity of thought to actually come up with some really qualitative answers. Yeah, so again, if you didn't get that, what does giving effect to the principles of the treaty look like for a nation? Kia ora? It's not in your jars. Te Tiriti.
Perfect. Hopefully everybody heard that. The pātai up there was the treaty or Te Tiriti, and that might be a topic of conversation as well. It's certainly one that I lean into quite frequently because, as we know, there are different interpretations. And when we get to the kōrero later on this evening after dinner, we'll have a panel chat about some of those factors. So just to sort of let you know the plan again. So time now to start to think about some of those pātai whilst you're mingling, catching up with friends, try and focus your conversation on those topics. We will then be doing a bit of a parking lot of things that you can think about that are actions. Hopefully someone at your table or a couple of people might write down some actions as you go through the evening. Keep the conversation going through dinner. We'll come and join you. We might even get up, scoff our food down and get up and come around and see how some of the conversation is going. The intentions after dinner is that we will come back. We will have a panel conversation amongst the three of us to these same topics and some of our own whakaaro that we'd like to share with you. And then we'll ask for some reporting back from the room before we continue into some drinks later into the evening. So dinner's due to drop in about 20 minutes or so we've got some time for some kōrero, some wine, and catching up whilst we start the conversation. But otherwise, we will see you after dinner for the panel. Any pātai? No? Does it feel like mahi? Yeah. Have fun with it, guys. Enjoy. Kia ora koutou, kia ora, kia ora, kia ora, kia ora. It's good to hear so much conversation flowing because now's the time for us to have a bit of a kōrero. So what we're keen to do now is hear some of the whakaaro about the different conversations that were had over dinner. We'll chime in, we might throw the mic around to different people in the room. If you don't think you need a mic, feel free to just jump up and speak. If you do think that you'd like one, Nathan might roam around and pass that on to you. But the idea is to really create a safe space here for conversation. The point was to get the different kōrero happening and for us all to just feel comfortable and sort of talking about some of these really challenging topics, which are also really exciting, right? Because this is the future that we're creating through the mahi that we do. So, where am I going to start? Everyone looks panicked. I'm going to start over at the table that I was sitting at because I heard some of that whakaaro and I know there's some good thoughts there. So tell us a little bit about what was happening in the conversation over here at table 1.
The key to this team is don't be shy. It's okay, it's a very safe forum. Kia ora.
Making a decision.
This is going to be a long night if no one takes the mic. We had a serious workload because you'll notice, even though we had a lot of the experts sitting with us, they weren't giving us answers. So there were 5 questions, and I think we had a really good discussion of question 1. And you did have some thoughts, and so I am going to pass.
Well done. So, yep, there was a lot of discussion, and especially around how it affected our personal lives and the difference between the personal banter that was going on here, which was probably 80%, versus, you know, taking that into a professional realm and seeing how different those conversations are and even how you talk about it or articulate it. But kind of why I've got the mic is there's a big... one of my observations that we discussed was people nowadays are very quick to ask questions of Māori and expect an answer. It's very easy to ask a question. It's way more difficult to understand the answer, especially if it's from a different paradigm. So therefore, what tools and methods does the profession need to be able to hold the answer respectfully that they're being given? And also to acknowledge that that answer may be small to start, but it's not finite. That it will be built on and built on the more you can understand the answer. So, yeah, that was our thing. How do you hold the answer?
Ho mai paki for table 1 whānau. That was a very, very, very high bar. Nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa.
Hi, that's perfect pātai. I'm keen to hear the whakaaro from one of the other tepu on what they think about what the answer to that might actually be. So sort of my reflection on that is, what tools do professionals need to understand the answer to what Māori are providing in some of these conversations? Do you feel equipped? Do you feel equipped to participate in some of the conversations that we're having to have as a nation? I know, Andrew, when you opened us tonight with your speech, that you spoke about that yourself, that sometimes going into these conversations can be really challenging, and that we sit in them and go, I'm not sure how to participate in this. Do people feel comfortable and confident in going into these conversations and understanding and interpreting some of the discourse that is happening?
Well, table 6 was talking about mātauranga and what that meant. So maybe table 6 can add to that dialogue.
Whānau, give it up for table 6.
Look, that's a really tough act to follow, so it's not going to be that good. It's not a response to your question, but one of the questions that we focused on is what do we think mātauranga is? And I'd like to drag everyone into it. We felt that it was a worldview, which was informed by a whole lot of things, the te reo, ancestral and stories and belief systems that are passed down. We also had the benefit of Diane sitting at our table and maybe finessing that somewhat to incorporate more a knowledge system and how that is informed, maybe not how we traditionally, well, I'm speaking for myself, how we Pākehā traditionally would see knowledge as being something that you go in, particularly in what we do, we've gone and specialised, we have experts in each little niche, but it's a knowledge that is much more holistic than that.
And just sort of reflecting on that, one of the first things that you mentioned there was the importance of te reo in understanding mātauranga, and maybe that ties back to the first pātai to the room around how to engage with Māori concepts if you don't have te reo And so understanding a word like mātauranga becomes very challenging, right, if you don't actually have the knowledge of what went into making that kupu what it is throughout the hundreds and thousands of generations that it was in existence. I don't know if many people have heard this statement, but ko te reo te Māori o te mana Māori. So te reo Māori, the language, is the Māori of being Māori. So when we're talking about Māori concepts, how can you lean into them and understand them if you don't have the reo? What do people think of that? Do you think it's possible? Or do we feel like we need to make a greater commitment to understanding the language to be able to effectively participate in these conversations? I'm going to pause until someone from the room has some thoughts. Be brave.
Coming to it with an open mind. You don't have to learn the language or be fluent in the language, but I think you have to start with the language. But I think that you can understand some of the concepts. Even what you've been saying tonight, I don't speak te reo at all, but I understand the words and I can get the context of some of what you're saying, because I've made a little bit of an investment into starting that journey. But I wouldn't say that I'm learning the reo. I'm just trying to understand a little bit more about this Te Ao Māori world.
Karo.
It's an interesting whakaaro that you've just provided, and I think it's sort of really, really beautifully framed, and some things in te reo Māori describe things in a much, much richer and deeper way than any kupu or te Pākehā kōrero can ever achieve. And I think that's the real beauty of bringing in the elements of mātauranga into all of our work. So, bit of a left field question if I may, but each one of us are probably trying to achieve things in our different journeys, in our different spaces, in our professional bodies. Has anybody got anything that they want to share with the rest of the forum that they're actually doing to support that journey for their own whānau within their own companies? No mai, don't be shy. I see a hand there. Gotcha.
Because of the situation we've been in for the last few generations, and not such a bicultural nation, there are plenty of situations where there are kaumātua and kuria who are very informed on mātauranga but may not be fluent in te reo. And so we need to respect that. We need to respect, I suggest we need to respect that. We do not assume that it's necessary to have te reo.
Kia ora. Beautiful observation.
I think we might jump to one of the other tables. Table 2, you're pretty close to me. Tell us about your conversations over dinner.
O mai te pake for table 2 whānau.
Kia ora koutou. Well, we had some interesting discussions, and the question that I thought we might focus on is the question about where do we want to be as a nation in 2040, 200 years on from signing Te Tiriti, and what does Te Tiriti actualised look like? And some of the themes that came through in that discussion were themes of a desire for a sense of unity, which needs to be founded on a shared set of outcomes. There's a sense that at the moment we are perhaps on the precipice of heading in that direction, but at present there's a sense of divisiveness which is perhaps a barrier to us getting there. But in the fullness of time, if we can focus on shared outcomes and focus on what brings us together, that might drive the sense of unity. So 2040, not actually that far away, but nonetheless a real opportunity to come together.
That's awesome. What do you think of that, Table 5? Does that sound fair and reasonable? Does it sound achievable?
Well, now we're getting in the rhythm. Perfect.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Cedric tōku ingoa. Te motu Philippine tōku te Rongowhakaata. So my name's Cedric Cairnsea. Just in terms of my background, I thought I'd share that I'm Filipino. So yeah, just a different history. I was born there and come to New Zealand when I was younger. The question that Phil just addressed before, where do we want to be as a nation in 2040? 200 years on from signing Te Tiriti or Waitangi, and what does Te Tiriti actualised look like? The word that comes to mind there that struck me most is we. Where do we want to be as a nation? And I had the privilege of being up in Auckland not so long ago. Haven't been to Auckland for many years. And while I was up there, my wife and I decided to take the public transport system. And there were several things we noticed. Te reo was spoken on the buses. Every bus stop, te reo was spoken. It was the name of the location in te reo, followed by English. The other thing we noticed as we were taking the public transport is how multicultural Auckland is nowadays. It's been many years there. I certainly don't remember how many nationalities were represented on the buses. Chinese, Southeast Asians, from the different islands, Indians, so many. And I'm thinking, where do we want to be as a nation in 2040? The first word that comes to my mind is consultation, shared values. What are they? Yes, we've got the treaty that informs all of that, but we've got a nation that is very multicultural now, and there are shared values we need to account for in figuring out where do we want to be as a nation in 2040? What is our identity as New Zealand is moving forward with a nation where more and more we're getting all these different nations represented in New Zealand? So I think, yes, consultation, identification of shared values, and identifying what is that shared identity in the future.
Kia ora, that's awesome. I love that. There's so much to lean into there. One of the words I wrote down, which I'm keen to hear some other thoughts around the room on, is with that multicultural nation, do we think that there is a need for primacy of any particular voice? I think I'd almost go as far as to say there might be a primacy of a particular voice at the moment. Do we think that voice is representative of the diversity, or should we think that there is other primacy of voices that needs to exist? Really keen on people's thoughts on that, because that's kind of really starting to get into this topic, right? It's where some of the controversy comes in. Do we think that there is one voice, one particular lens that might be leading some perspectives in this nation at the moment? Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? Nath, do you want to get a mic over here?
Now, we'll just bring this over so we can hear your beautiful, beautiful voice.
Just you mentioned the word primacy, so I was saying the Cane whānau submission on the Otago RPS is asking about full primacy in terms of use of Māori land, butting up against all other Section 6 matters of the RMA. So watch the space.
Yep. Has anybody ever heard the statement first peoples first? Put your hand up if you've ever heard someone make reference to that, first peoples first. Yeah? What do we think of that? That's probably at the crux of sort of this conversation around multicultural nations and whether there should be a prevailing voice. Do we think that first peoples' opinions should prevail? Should they be equal to all values and opinions in society? It's a very quiet room. Is it because they're heavy topics? Did you guys have too much wine? What's going on? Waitaha Dai? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, interesting kōrero. So what Di was saying
We've got
there
a little
was...
question here from table 9, if I may.
Yeah.
I'll say an observation that I'm seeing with my children is that they don't see some of the differences that we perceive. Mm-hmm. And so they see a lot more coming together of people and doing the best for the whole. And so even when there's language barriers, they can still get down and play together. They still figure it out, and they come from a real, I guess, perception of doing the best for people and as a whole. And so I see with them, and I see, thinking about 2040 and where they are by 2040. And I just think if they can see inherent good in people and their views and have got open minds to that I think we'll be in a very different place than what we are now. And you see the language, the te reo that they speak, because it's ingrained in everyday language at school, has just come so much leaps and bounds into understanding and to comprehension. So I think in 2040, we'll have a very, very different place with even the children coming through now.
Yeah, kia ora, Gemma. Beautiful whakaaro.
Yeah, that's similar to what we were talking about on table 1 was very similar. Whakaaro was the future in 2040 would be a naturalisation of te reo Māori, so it enables and supports all of Aotearoa to navigate these complex changes that we're experiencing environmentally. Because ultimately, we should be thinking about how we can enable and support mokopuna decisions to be uplifted. Because at the end of the day, that should be what we're focusing on, is making sure we're having decisions made to support our mokopuna across Aotearoa rather than ourselves right now.
Okay, let's jump to table 3. What was the focus of the conversation over dinner, guys?
Perfect. Tell us the journey.
I feel like we had more questions than answers, but that's probably the point. In terms of the 2040 sort of time frame of identifying as a Māori, what will the expectation of RM law be? More intrinsically Māori, we pondered. Hard to know what expectations will be. And sort of the idea of it being less formal and adversarial and more in line with the Māori sort of tikanga and approach. Anything else we want to add? We also talked about the question of how do we afford mana whenua agency in managing rohe, and how do we support that, and the real issue with capability and capacity and the background needed for those roles, and just sort of thinking about what would go into growing these people, and also the relationships between iwi in different locations, and how those roles would differ depending on the location as well. Otherwise, I think everyone's sort of covered a lot of what we talked about.
Cool, thank you. Look, I think we're getting to a point where we might almost move into the panel conversation, but I think there's one table at the back that's been really quiet, table 7. So we want to hear a decent, robust sort of wrap up from your table. Tell us a little bit about what was happening over there. Oh, that's
Perfect.
good.
The last table's got too much to say. Ko mai te pake whānau.
Well, because we've had a bit of time to prepare, Nikki and I have come up with a percussive rap duet just to tie things together. Or not. So amazing to hear such great values-driven talk coming from a lot of the tables. And ultimately, the legislation can only enable the best of the society. And so it's interesting to look at where we are at the moment, where we are just starting to get to grips with mātauranga Māori, but we are also not clearly expressing the multiplicity of positive values, maybe through the Pakeha Society. And so if we can bring those two things together, we have a really strong roadmap that then the legislation can enable. And we would hope that, that is the path that we can follow in the short term, and that then the legislation would follow on from those positive values.
And do you think it's helped if we try to build relationships between each other? Is that going to be one of the tools in the toolbox to move us along towards that 2040 better understanding?
Kia ora koutou, ko Nikki Smith Mahou. Thanks, Di. Yes, I agree. I think for me it's about kōrero. And in my experience, I just think, oh my goodness, the more I learn, the less I realise I know. And I think it's all about talking. It's all about the conversations that we have with each other and engaging, particularly with Māori if we don't understand, but it just takes a lot of conversation, and we should be open to that. I mean, I have two mokopuna who are Ngāi Tahu and a son who's Ngāi Tahu, and so I'm kind of aware, but I just don't know enough in my practice, in my realm of as a landscape architect, to understand Te Ao Māori views and perspectives, and I feel slightly uncomfortable about my practice where I'm supposed to identify cultural values associations. So I'm really struggling with that, and I feel slightly overwhelmed at times, but I've realised in the latest project I've been working on, Elsa has been a huge help to me, and I've learnt just so much and aware of so much more than I need to know. But yeah, I would just strongly recommend kōrero and learning te reo as much as possible. I think it really helps, and I love the idea that maybe we can get some signage throughout New Zealand that says place names in Māori, because I think they're beautiful and I think they say something about the whenua, and I'm excited. I'm excited about where we are actually, because I think that we are moving towards a positive outcome, and I'm very hopeful.
Thank you, and I think what you said in so many words, humility and honesty, actually admitting that we need to know more all the time, is something that's hard to do sometimes, so thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you. That was a beautiful wrap-up. You guys brought it, table 7. Well done. Yeah, I think that vulnerability and humility, and just to hear that honest conversation. It took a wee while to get around the room for people to start to lean in, but that vulnerability and talking about things like feeling overwhelmed is okay. They're the types of conversations, you're absolutely right, that we need to be having for us to be able to make progress. I've actually found it quite interesting moving back to Aotearoa after being overseas for a while in countries which are much larger. And one of the things I've noticed since being back is we aren't very good at actually having challenging conversations. And I've been trying to put my finger on what that is. Why don't we talk about the tricky stuff? And I think part of it is actually scale and size of our communities And we know that tomorrow we've got to get up and we're going to drop the kids at daycare, and we'll probably see one of the other mums who happens to be a lawyer at another firm, and we've been, in a case together. And so we're very sort of tentative about dipping our toes into a challenging conversation, because we know we're going to encounter these people again, or we might end up working for their organisation. And I do feel sometimes that might be holding us back. In other countries, they seem to be a little bit more cutthroat and just get in there and actually tend to make more progress because they are willing to put the topics on the table and to have the conversation. So I just, before we do jump into the panel kōrero to talk about some of these topics amongst ourselves, just really encourage you all to participate, to show up in these conversations. We need the humility, we need the honesty, and hopefully out of tonight, when we get a couple more drinks in after this, the conversation will keep flowing, and you bring that into your workplaces and continue the kōrero. But these two wonderful people are a massive part of my life, and I learn a lot from them both every day. So I'm keen to hear some of their thoughts, and we have done a little bit of prep around things that we want to touch on, but we're also going to be pretty off the cuff, because that's what a good conversation is, right? You don't go in with a whole heap of notes. We're going to cover the same topics that were in your jars. And just have a fairly candid talk amongst ourselves. But I actually encourage you to interrupt us. If we say something that you think is controversial or that you want to share a thought on, jump in. This is for all of us to participate in. But yeah, so, kei te pai kōrero? All right, so the first one we were going to talk about was Te Tiriti. And there's been a big focus on that so far this evening. One of the words that we wrote down when we were sort of doing a little bit of prep was the word tino rangatiratanga. You can't talk about Te Tiriti or Waitangi and not talk about tino rangatiratanga. So we were keen to just share some of our thoughts. I guess for me, just to kick off, the first thing that comes to my mind is the word sovereignty, but it's actually the fact that we never ceded our sovereignty. And I think there's still, from my perspective in the work and the things that I see, there is still a perception that Māori gave up their sovereignty actively, and that they knew that when they signed Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And I just don't think my ancestors were that stupid. I think we signed Te Tiriti or Waitangi for other reasons, but I cannot see why we would have ever ceded our sovereignty when we didn't govern over the whenua. It was part of our whakapapa, and you would never cede your whakapapa. So that's sort of beyond me, but just keen to start the kōrero there on what you think that word tino rangatiratanga means to you.
If I can just jump in very quickly, I was privileged to spend time with the late Te Awanui Black, and he described it in a very, very unique way, which really, really resonated with me as a Scottish person, as a tauiwi, which was when our whenua is sick, when our lakes are sick, when our forest is sick, we akin that to my grandmother being sick, my grandfather being sick, my mokopuna being sick. And so when I think about tino rangatiratanga, it's about the manaakitanga and the care that must be applied to that whenua. And if you think about it in the tiro rangatiratanga frame, would you give away your grandma? Would you give away your mokopuna? Would you give away your koro? It's probably a healthy place to begin.
And it wasn't even maybe talking about giving away, because it was about relationships with land that wasn't owned in the Torrens system of subdivide, identify, register, and then in perpetuity it is segregated from another bit of land and so on. So that just wasn't in the vocabulary, and it wasn't in the thinking, is my understanding. But another hitch, of course, is that, as you know, there were two different language versions of the treaty, and the 500 Māori, most of them at least, signed the one in Māori language that says something rather different, and it says that tino rangatiratanga is guaranteed, and that they were guaranteed use, possession of their lands, forests, and things they valued. So we have a talking past each other, even though there was the treaty or the two treaties. So what sort of tools do we need to move forward to accept that there's different views, but that in taking one view, there's an enormous injustice to people who may have understood that it was something entirely different. Are there tools that we need? I was having a conversation with an Aboriginal friend about what they had been doing, which was truth and reconciliation. And I said, oh, we don't really need that because there weren't too many lies told. And then I realised actually that wasn't true, that we had been brought up on things that were, you could nicely say, a soft version of what actually did happen in the wars for New Zealand, the battles over land, the battles where in Kāiwi, for instance, if there's anybody from Wanganui, I read a version of what had happened in the newspaper. It said that there had been a victory, and local people had said, yes, some 10 or 12-year-old boys were shot and killed, and the army then claimed that as a victory. So some of what was told is victories and deeds that might have been classed as valiant and noble were perhaps in closer examination not as noble as we would like to think they are now. So a while ago there was a group of school children, college children in Waikato had asked that their history be told in schools, and that had started the bringing back, if you like, of New Zealand history into the curriculum because they had heard of some of the sad and brutal fighting that had taken place on their doorstep, but they had heard it later. It had been suppressed and not talked about as perhaps inappropriate for school children, but stories such as churches being set fire to with women and children sheltering inside them. I guess many have heard of Rangiawhia and other sorts of battles like that. So maybe understanding where we've come from very clearly is something that we need to do before we can move on. Maybe that's one of the tools that we need to put in our toolbox.
I mean, it's a bit undeniable these days that there's been a huge teaching of false histories, not just in Aotearoa, but in many nations where there are First Peoples. And that there has been, you know, that we are actually, most of us looking around the room are of a generation that were a product of a false education that was misleading. And it's really interesting to reflect on that and what our role is through our contemporary professional mahi to ensure that we are truth-telling and that we are remembering, not necessarily, I know there's always this, come on, let's move on, like it's happened in the past, do we have to keep bringing this up? But a lot of it does get forgotten, some of those atrocities. And so what is our duty of responsibility and duty of care is a big question that I ask my colleagues every day of truth-telling and that truth influencing the way that we work, particularly in those social justice spaces. One of the other notes that I had here, which sort of ties to that actually, is naturalisation of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And I know, Nath, you've got some really strong opinions around, you know, those principles that Di was just talking about and reminding people that it exists and having professionals who are actually competent at explaining that, particularly professionals who are standing up in court or in expert witness roles and are talking to those histories and what that means for the whakapapa of te taiao that they're working with. keen on your whakaaro that you know, and we've spoken about it a bit, but for others to hear some of those thoughts.
Yeah, with all due respect, I have the absolute privilege of working across multiple spheres of influence in professional areas. That's both also with spectrum of understanding. And one of the most challenging things that I find in that space is the absolute chasm of understanding that exists in Aotearoa. And I think if we could really reinvigorate, own that space together as a nation, we would be in a much, much stronger position to take the next step forward with a sure footing. You have to look backwards to go forwards. And it's really important that when you are looking backwards, that's looking backwards with both eyes and not one set. Because there are two versions of what happened, and there are two outcomes that have been observed. And I think that's a really, really important challenge for us all, is to be curious. And if you are learning something that you can share with somebody else about your curiosity and your learning, then that's actually a really, really beautiful starting place for us to take the next step as a nation. Because it's going to be really important for us where we're heading, and to treat each other well. And I think that's the essence of treaty.
Kia ora. That's awesome, Nathan. So let's sort of move on to the next topic that we had here, which was around cultural constructs. And we've spoken about this a bit, about whether law and law, L-O-R-E, are cultural constructs. Are they different things? Are they the same? How are they interconnected? And we were talking about law is a cultural construct, as is nature, as is landscape, as is te taiao. And we were wondering what people think these things are and how they differ amongst cultures. And actually Cedric, I think was your name. Cedric, you know, you spoke a little bit about it before, that when we come from different cultures, we have different experiences of place and we bring different lenses and perspectives. I'm always really interested to sort of explore how good we are as New Zealanders at actually respecting and understanding cultural differences and cultural constructs. And whether there is sort of a prevailing or dominant cultural construct that we naturally defer to, which I personally think is actually tied to the colonial experience that is the world that we live in now in Aotearoa. But how does that inform how we think about landscape?
Looks like I'm on the hot seat. Yes, landscape as a cultural construct. I'm not sure whether any of you have talked to, for instance, Chinese, find out what Chinese think is landscape. What do those in the Middle East, in Lebanon, for instance, think is landscape? Because there is no word in many languages for landscape, and that is because it came from Europe as a construct from Germany, Holland, and so on, which then moved into other places. And so this is one word that has spread in English language, meaning several things. It certainly means what we might see out there, but it's also used as a general term such as the law landscape, for instance, meaning general things being discussed to do with the law. So when you are trying to tease out a word in one language and then move to discuss it in another worldview, another cultural construct, how do you start dealing with that? Because there was no word for that. And how do you start to recognise and raise the respect and value and significance of the words that were used in other languages that will add richness to each language if you start to understand things differently. But by simply applying it as if it is a fact, just as, and I know quite a few of you were trained in the law here, just as law is also a cultural construct. The law is different in different cultures. So that's what I'm meaning by cultural construct. It's developed by the culture itself. It isn't something that is out there that you can necessarily measure as you would a scientific object, for instance. So how can we start dealing with these different concepts and tell truth to them as well? Treat them with respect and understand that there are all sorts of different nuances to do with what may be a landscape in a Māori sense. It may be talking about land, but it may be talking about the interrelationship of people and the land, and it may be talking about the interrelationship of people and the creation story, and about each god that may have an association with a particular landscape feature, and it may be talking about the cosmos and all sorts of other things that are all part of that understanding that you might call landscape, but you might call it something such as Te Aotearoa in Māori. So, comments? Oh, I agree, and I will probably use that as the translation, knowing that it all, in Māori, context is everything as well. The people who are using that particular approach, it's important to them, so they may have a different understanding of it, so look to the context as well as how you're applying that. Sorry? Yeah. Yes, that's right. 2 words, yeah. Yes, and so there are many analogies to living bodies as well that are sometimes used, such as whare as a person that you enter into as well, and every part of that. So yes, that helps to add to the richness of understanding of what that is, and the association of people who are then part of the whenua.
Another really good example to exemplify that particular whakaaro that we're trying to articulate here is the kōrero on tamano te wai. So the freshwater reforms are requiring tamano te wai to be acknowledged, but to different iwi, to different hapu, to different kaitiaki, tamano te wai has layers, multiple layers depending on the context. When you're trying to weave that sort of whakaaro into a modern context, it is very, very precarious to just put it into objectives, policies, methods, te mea. And so the challenge is listening more, I think, because that's often where the opportunity comes to actually acknowledge both versions of the need. And ultimately, that's te mano te wai.
Yeah. And when we then move with language into law, it will have a precise meaning and be defined often by that particular clause or law. And I'm thinking now of kaitiaki, which has been defined in law. And if you speak to many Māori kaitiaki, you will find that they may see it in a totally different way as a responsibility and part of tikanga, and something that is an obligation as much as a responsibility. So understanding that a word that has been defined in a certain way as part of language may not necessarily be how that word is used in a much broader context.
Kia ora, awesome kōrero and wonderful whakaaro that were added there. There's so much complexity and richness that sits in this, and even just that, the kōrero around the word whenua, and almost for me feeling a little bit protective of words like that, particularly when we start to talk about the whenua, which is the afterbirth, and the returning of the whenua, ki te whenua, and that some of these concepts which have become written into legislation or talked about in common society as a passing word in conversation actually carry a whole story and whakapapa of their own. And so sometimes as Māori, it can feel very uncomfortable to have those words so commodified in an English context and used in policy and legislation to make arguments in a court of law. So it's a challenging environment for us to move towards what people are referring to as bicultural. And, you know, we spoke a little bit about mātauranga, we'll get to that a little bit more later, but the inherent fear that sits in, I can only speak for myself, in the sharing of our culture when so much of it has been appropriated and misinterpreted and put into context and into legislation in ways that actually distorts something that has been carried with us throughout our journeys from Te Moana Nui a Kiwa across the Pacific, and possibly beforehand through our whakapapa in the way that we are knowing and being. To see them now just being a general part of society is awesome, but without the true depth of understanding, sometimes it feels very tokenistic. So sort of thinking about that, korua, how do we support iwi, hapu, whānau, probably particularly hapu, and their aspirations as professionals, given we're still learning, many people are still learning, to understand some of these kupu, understand some of our ways of knowing and being? How can we help Aotearoa step forward into a future while we're still on this journey? This is like the paddling the waka, building at the same time and bailing water. What are the steps to working together with iwi?
I can talk quite confidently about this in a little bit more depth, and I think it's a journey I want to take you on. So in a former role, I was the Cultural Technical RMA Specialist for the Bay of Plenty Regional Council. It's a position I held for 9 years. And now as the kaitohu for my new organisation, the same challenges exist. There's a couple. The first one is, man, you fellas talking fancy language. It's like really fancy and it's really hard to get. And I think if you just strip it all out, what are you actually trying to say? And if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, are you actually explaining it that well? Because there's probably an opportunity there to tweak it a little bit. The reason I say that is because I provide awhi and tautoko for iwi Māori across Aotearoa, and vice versa, to try and understand the subtleties and the challenges and what this big RMA machine means and what does it do and what does the Local Government Act do and what are the levers? And that's actually really, really humbling, but it's also really, really scary, because we need more iwi Māori to be supported in this space. And so it's really just about making sure that we can, at every single step, open that opportunity. Not as we know it all, because we don't, but actually we need each other because we do. And I think that's a really, really healthy starting point. Breaking down that real heavy language is a really, really good step, because it doesn't have to be described in such technical language.
Another thing, I wonder whether we can mentor with the skills, the small amount of skills that we might have, mentor young professionals who are coming on, that upskilling as fast as you possibly can would seem to me to add benefit to social inclusion, social justice, because I know my iwi Rongowhakaata are struggling, and there are others that are struggling as well, just with capacity, and there are many requests. Everybody seems to want a relationship with them. Everybody wants to engage with them for various reasons of their own, and they just don't have the capacity to be able to do that. They've got their own aspirations rather than to need to respond to others that come along that regard theirs as urgent and compelling and everything else. So how can we support and assist so that we're all I guess getting to that 2040 with similar capabilities so we can add that richness each way. We can support each other rather than using the skills that we have rather selfishly. How can we think of other ways that we might improve that capability and capacity so that we're all able to respond?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I completely agree. And looking for the innovation, because at the moment, what I'm finding is we're taking from the Rūnaka, from the hapu, from the resources that they're trying to nurture, and we're taking them into our own corporate awhi, because they can get paid more. So what's the innovation there that we can support this space in? I think the other thing to really be really cognizant of too in these conversations is, for many iwi Māori across Aotearoa for many, many years, they have been removed from the system. They have been pushed away. They have been completely stripped of any opportunity to participate. And now, here we are, tell us your mātauranga. Well, we've got to give them a space, time to reinvigorate that, to relearn some of that stuff. And we need to do it in a caring way, because the capacity challenges across Aotearoa in this space are dire. And I see it, and I work in this space. And every chance I get, I really try and push that wero out, the challenge. How can you support this journey of getting this capability and capacity met and done with a caring way? On the back of that, what can RMLA do? Yeah, that's my next wero. It was actually going to be a little whakaaro that I was going to hold for later. So, kia ora e hoa. There's some quite innovative things occurring across Aotearoa to try and meet these needs, both from regional council, local council, Rūnaka, hapu, kaitiaki. Everybody's trying to connect the dots here. What is RMLA doing in this space to connect the dots in your sphere of influence? And more importantly, how can you help us connect the dots? So we're katoa, connecting the dots, because it's the sum of all the parts that are going to achieve all of the challenges that we've got ahead of us. And you can't do it alone. And you can't keep robbing Peter to pay Paul, because that's not a sustainable model either. So where is the strategy for our professional bodies to enable these conversations first, the care that must be applied second, and then the drive to recognise that rangatahi have a space here. It's not just for the older ones, it's also for them.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks for tying it back to the responsibility of our professional bodies and institutes as well to step up in these spaces. So this is us as individuals, it's the organisations that we work for, and it's the memberships that we are part of, and everybody needs to be accountable, right, in this future. That rob Peter to pay Paul, just to sort of elaborate on that slightly, in this instance, it is robbing Rūnaka, it is robbing iwi to pay consulting practice so that they can put these people into places that are actually often quite uncomfortable for them unless you have cultural safety wrapped around your organisation. We're taking a number of our young Māori out of spaces that feel safe for them, and we're exposing them and putting them often by themselves into quite risky situations without that mentoring either from within the organisation or within the professional bodies to help them be safe and practice effectively. One of my notes here is it's very challenging, right, to make this intergenerational investment. If it wasn't for my iwi making that investment in me 25 years ago to get me to where I am now, there wouldn't be many of us sitting around this table, because it does take a long time to scaffold and grow Māori to feel safe and competent, both in their cultural sense and in their technical area, to be able to stand up and have these conversations. So that investment is absolutely critical. And actually, I was just going to ask a quick pass over the room before coming back to you, Nath. How many people here tonight, and if you whakamara about your age, kei te pai, are under 25? 3 people was our investment in the future in this room this evening. This was not an expensive event. We could have brought more rangatahi to attend this conversation. How many people or how many organisations in this room brought a representative who was Māori? 2 organisations. Yeah. Oh, we counted? Yeah, kei te pai. 2 organisations, and I don't know if that's because you don't have Māori staff within your organisation. I don't want to inquire into it too much, but something to reflect on, whether they were asked, whether they don't exist, whether you should be thinking about a strategy to create space for them to either be at this table or to be in your organisations and to therefore participate here, but just something to maybe keep in the back of the mind.
Yeah, and one more word of caution too, if I may, because I see it a lot. We bring iwi Māori practitioners, kaitiaki, rangatahi into our businesses to support us. Well, give them space, man. Because what you end up finding is they're dialer karakia, dialer mātauranga expert, dialer call auntie, dialer do everything and their other jobs. So how can we actually work out a better strategy to enable all of it to occur, but still taking recognition that actually they're going above and beyond most of the time? I think that's a really, really important point to just take back to your own spaces, is they're doing more than just their job.
So I'm looking at time, and I'm conscious that we are running out, and these conversations need, much longer than we have this evening. The last point that we were going to touch on amongst the 3 of us was that kupu mātauranga. Fascinates me, this word. It's like it's just growing legs and run away down the street. You hear it, I hear it probably almost as much as I hear Māori and kaitiaki. That word mātauranga means a huge amount to me, and a lot of my learning around that kupu has come from Tahu Karamu Charles Royal, and I know, Di, that you've been with Tahu Karamu over the weekend, and the whakapapa that sits in that word mātauranga and the commodification that's happened of that word, but also mātauranga as a construct that existed within Te Ao Māori throughout our histories, and that came with us from Te Moana Nui a Kiwa. Should we touch on it quickly before we start to head towards closing the evening?
Just ask the audience, should we touch on it quickly?
Mātauranga? Yeah. Ka pai. Yeah. Di, you've spent some time with Te Ahu Karamu over the weekend, so I'm sure you have lots of whakaaro about this.
Yes, so what Alayna is referring to is a understanding of mātauranga that is pretty well all-encompassing. We're talking about everything from language, culture, voice, beliefs, rituals, all of the culture, but all of the culture that has been here 1,000 years or so. And so understanding of how the systems work, how they worked in the ideas that were brought from the Pacific. Developed so that we discuss the maramataka at our table, and what is that, which is an understanding of what is associated with each change of the season, what will thrive at certain times of the year in certain circumstance, and developed by each hapu, because of course the moon rises, falls and does different things in different places, so it must be related. But it's also a reflection on an entirely different way of thinking, because for instance, the Gregorian calendar is done on a solar system. Maramataka is on the moon system. And so when we talk about different times of the year and use different words, even Māori words for different times of the year, we're trying to change one part of that understanding, that Māori knowledge, and put it into a different context. So I think we have to think about those sort of things, and therefore do our best to support the richness and the uniqueness of one culture's knowledge, which is entirely different from another's cultural knowledge, and treat them equally rather than one as fairy tales and folklore and the other as science. That, I think, is something that we need to come to terms with too. I think I strayed off the subject, actually.
Yeah, as a marine and freshwater scientist, somebody mentioned down in one of the tables down the back that the more you learn, the more of an infant you feel. And Mātauranga Māori is one of those spaces where that's how it makes me feel. Because the beauty and the depth of the knowledge is just profound. Especially when you're looking at it from a couple of aspects. Harvesting. You know, looking at rongoa Māori medicines, harvesting at the right time. It's all based on mātauranga. I think it's an important point to think about the context in which mātauranga has been used, because it has layers. And we've got 200 years of probably scientific observation here in Aotearoa and a Western construct. But we've got over 600 to 700 years of observation in mātauranga that we can also draw upon to help us understand in a deeper way the patterns that have existed in our tataiao, which also form a much, much better decision-making framework to support all of our restoration programs and te all those sorts of things. If I may, I've got an example which I often talk about, and it's a really, really simple one, and it's one that's quite personal to me. So if I may, I'll just share this with you. So when I was doing my marine science degree, I also did a scientific divers certification, and one of the things that I did that for was to measure the TLI index in lakes. It's a trophic level index. Basically, it measures how healthy is the lake. Very, very simple. And you measure it on a couple of things. You look at the number of organisms in situ, you look at the types of weeds, etc., and then you basically put a calculation up. It's got a number above X. It's pretty good. But one of those matrices relies on counting coda. So what we would do is we'd chuck all our dive tanks on, go make a hell of a noise, out in the boat, jump down, bubbles blowing everywhere, and we'd go along the bottom of the lake bed and count the coda. Now, that's cool. That's one way you can do it. But tikanga kōrero, the mātauranga actually is, you go and take a bit of tea tree, you break it off, you tie your harakeke to that tea tree, you row out, you drop the tea tree in the bottom of the moana, and you leave it there for a couple of days. And what happens is the coda go, woo, there's a new home. And so they move in. And then what happens is a couple of days later, you just go out and you pull the tea tree up and you shake it and you count them that way. Which one would you rather? And which one's less intrusive? And which one's less invasive? So there's the beauty of bringing Mātauranga Māori into our decision-making framework. And it's not just fairy dust. Great question. I can tell you what was warmer, but the second methodology, 100% more accurate, time and time again. And that's just a very, very, very simple example in one sphere in the context of scientific diving.
Ka pai, kia ora. I'm going to move us on to sort of the concluding point of the evening. You might remember at the very beginning I said that we're going to do a quick whip around of actions. What I'm keen to hear is one takeaway message from each tepu. It's probably the boldest, bravest person that's willing to have some whakaaro by this point of the night, around what action you will either take forward as an individual or on behalf of your organisation, or that you expect of the RMLA to come out of this conversation and take next steps to actively move towards change in Aotearoa. Let's just go around the room. Tepu 1.
Start us off. Okay. As the acting president of the Resource Management Law Association.
Someone write these down.
Or current president, I should say, not acting. Message heard loud and clear. I have personally been working with the powers that be within the organisation to try and ask what can RMLA do to get in this space. Some of you will be familiar with Papa Panamu, and a few of us helped set that up over 10 years ago, and so now RMLA is tracking in the same space. We are really struggling to reach out to Māori practitioners to have an authentic discussion, because everyone's so busy and everything you've said is, we all know is true. But simple answer, watch the space in terms of the RMLA conference. We're going to have a pre-conference hui. We have the likes of Justice Whata showing up to have a conversation in private, focused on Māori, not the majority of RMLA members. Judge Tapani will be coming too, and others, to have a conversation. So that's something we're doing as an example.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
And we'll be looking to you guys to help out too.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. There's probably a number of ideas that have mullen through people's heads, but the point of this is so we're sharing katoa. Remember how we started? Katoa. Sum of all the parts to achieve the goal.
Just that point around humility. I thought that was a really good action. It's something difficult when your profession and your career relies on you being an expert to all of a sudden not be, and to have to show humility. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths that a person can have.
Kia ora. Di, how about over at your tepu?
It's not so much an action point exactly, but it's something that this evening has really given to me, which is an increased confidence to do more and look deeper and explore there as well. That's just something that this evening has really, really underlined for me, and it's something that me and my team will look at further and in future.
Kia ora. Nath?
Kia ora. So I don't herald from these fine shores, but I'm here to learn and will continue to as long as I breathe. But my big takeaway from today would be that the meaning of all of these concepts that we struggle with day to day to try and figure out what they mean have been developed by cultures themselves, and that expands beyond just te reo and beyond just Māori, but treating them with respect and going in with open ears and not presuming you know what they mean is critical. So, ka pai.
Awesome. Wonderful. Di?
Hi there. One of my takeaways tonight was just about talking, kōrero, and I guess that mutual respect. And I think having that willingness to learn more te reo and more understanding of some vocabulary, and also about jargon, about not using those technical words relevant to your discipline. And I guess meeting in the middle and just open conversation, just like tonight. So.
Kia ora ho.
Kia ora. My takeaway was having a curiosity for the history and recognising that that's probably a big gap in my own knowledge, and so I'm looking to build into that.
Kia ora.
Are there any things that the association RMLA and its members, of course, might do as steps to make change? I know people have takeaways and that's helpful, but just wondering whether that can be a prompt as well.
This table has the fortune of having two views, if that's okay, so I'll start. And that's rangatahi. 3 out of this audience is under 25, and it's a challenge for all of our institutions. I'm not fortunate or unfortunate to be a member of RMLA. I'm a member of CIWEM, Chartered Institute of Water Environmental Management, if you're interested. And we also struggle with that same kind of conversation about bringing rangatahi on through the korero of understanding the impact they can have on water and environmental matters, and obviously the same here with RMLA. Second point from our table.
Kia ora. I am echoing a bit the sentiments about learning te reo Māori, but I haven't done a lot. The bit that I've done already has taught me a lot about tikanga as well, and I think it's really brought home the fact that there's a lot you can do to just step up as a practitioner, even if you're not Māori. Like, we can take some responsibility to understand concepts, and we come from a framework where the Western concepts are very well understood, and there's a good baseline knowledge, and when it comes to Māori concepts, we're leaning on people who are getting lent on a lot by everybody, and I know that it's difficult to be wrong, so I think that's some of it. You're hesitant to say what you think mātauranga means when you don't really know, but I feel like there can be some meeting in the middle, so I think there's a responsibility we can all take.
Yeah, kia ora.
Is that for me? Yeah, I've been handed the mic. I think the two takeaways from me, and maybe from an RMLA perspective, but a Boff Miscall's perspective, is that of time and space. Yeah. So, dealing with the MBA and the MBE reforms at the moment, I feel like the pressure is seriously on, and it seems like we don't have time to reflect on anything, and particularly in this engagement space as well. And then the second, I suppose, is just taking this step back and giving space to the people who we're trying to engage with. And also, from an internal perspective at Boff Miscall, I reflect on what you said about having these specialists and how we rely on them for every intricacy in every moment. Like, I think of Wiremu and Rangatahi in our office, and, I turn around to them and say, hey, can you just help me out with this? Can you just, and we are constantly on at them when they're trying, their best on every avenue. So I think, time and space are the two things for me.
Kia ora. I think one of the challenges from tonight is obviously a lot of reflection, and it is the humility that comes in from that. But one of the key takeaways, you see, what are our action points, is that quite often we will come to an event like this, we'll have some action points, and by the time tomorrow comes in, I'll get to it. By the time the weekend comes, what was it action? And by the time next week comes along, it's like, I did something last week, it was quite good, but I can't remember what it was. So on behalf of the RMLA Canterbury Committee, what I'll be undertaking is that in the next week, there will be a survey coming out to all the members of the RMLA and all the addresses we've got of people who have signed up for tonight, and there'll be some questions, and we want your feedback. We often send out these surveys, and we get very little feedback. One could say that everyone's happy with the committee's performance and what we're trying to do, but this is a conversation, it needs to keep going. So think about these actions, we'll send that out, please give us back the feedback, and that will give us as the committee the mandate, direction about what we need to do in the space, and then we can put together more events, more ways to work this forward so we can keep the conversation going. So that would be my comment on that one.
Wow, how's that for a conclusion? Was it our last tepu? We've got one more.
The simple thing is, it sounds organic. You know, we started talking about legislation and we're ending up talking about growing from the ground up, basically, aren't we?
Yeah. Kia ora koutou.
Mauri ora.
Yeah, mauri ora indeed. I think that's a really lovely way to sum up this evening, and I'm just so pleased everybody found their voice to share some of those whakaaro, and particularly to have that commitment from the RMLA to taking next steps once we walk out of the room, because you're absolutely right. We will all go back to our desks tomorrow morning and there will be 500 emails, 90% of them things that we don't want to look at, and it'll get lost. But the fact that you are committed to hearing the voices and the whakaaro of your membership says a huge amount. And hopefully that, as you mentioned, that will give you the opportunity to get direction, but it also sets a mandate, and it also gives opportunity for agency for people to share some of those thoughts as well. So I think we'll wrap up for the evening. I had written a few sort of concluding words. Formally structured words like this aren't my forte, so I am going to read it. But I have been adding to it over the night too, so if I stumble a little bit because there's scribbles all over this paper. But it's been a really meaningful conversation. It's really important for me to be able to stand in the mana of my whakapapa on my tūranga waiwai and acknowledge my tipuna tuahuriri and my fellow whānau members who are in the room with me tonight, who do feel a different ancestral obligation to having these conversations. They are challenging. They're particularly challenging for those of us who are having them really regularly. I feel like I've been saying the same shit for 20 years. And now everybody wants to listen, so that's cool. Well, someone gives me a mic, I'll take it. But it's a heavy load, and I really just acknowledge that kōrero from the Bofamiska table about that if there's only one or two people in your firm, they're probably equally as exhausted at having the same conversations over and over again. So I've really loved the fact that we are conscious of that, and that we lean in. For those of you who are tauiwi or tangata tiriti, that you lean into doing your own exploration of self and your knowledges and your cultural competency to take some of that burden off those of us who are doing this mahi regularly. But yes, a wonderful evening, so many conversations about so many topics, most of them challenging, but they are incredibly important for exploring the future of Aotearoa. I never had the pleasure of meeting Tony Hearn. I mentioned that earlier in the evening, but I've heard so many wonderful things about him, his demeanour, his character, his mahi. I think that he would be proud that we're having this conversation this evening. I think the willingness of each of you to participate, those of you who found your voice in this conversation, is incredibly impactful, and I think that does some justice to what he would have expected to see at a dinner of this nature in his memory. The future of Aotearoa will be what we make it. We actually possess an enormous amount of power in this room, to the extent that it kind of actually makes me a little bit nauseated, that so much power can sit amongst a small cohort of individuals when we have whole communities and a whole society to represent. But as today's lawyers, planners, designers, we do have that responsibility. We're all aware of it. Hopefully we're all taking it seriously. But it's not only to those community voices that we represent today, it's also mō tātou a mō ka uri a muri ake nei. So it's for those generations after us. That is really where the focus of our decision making needs to be. We must be accountable. We must seek environmental and social justice. That's actually our job. That's what we get paid to do. But we need to remain curious, as Nathan mentioned earlier, and questioning whether the projects that we work on are actually contributing to positive change, or whether there's a possibility that the way that you're going about your mahi, either personally or within your organisation or as a professional body, may further be perpetuating the colonial project that has landed us here in the first place. So a moment for reflection there on what we're actually doing in our work. The three of us want to thank you for leaning into the challenging conversations this evening, exploring difficult questions around identity, not just the identity of Aotearoa, but your own identity and positionality, and how those inherent biases that we all have might actually be informing the way that you work. Before we conclude, I I wanted to thank the RMLA, particularly for that commitment at the end, but for the invitation to speak, for the three of us to speak at this Tony Hearn Memorial Lecture this year. Upholding the mana of those who have gone before us means keeping their legacy alive. And from what I understand, Tony was a fierce advocate for justice, often working to ensure that marginalised groups had agency in decision making. In all of the reading that I've done about Tony, he was always advocating for the underdog to have voice. So I imagine that he probably had a similar, obviously a very different landscape that we're operating in now, but probably had a similar understanding and respect for the voice of Te Aotearoa, for the whakapapa of the whenua, for the personified landscape, which is a huge amount of what our duty of responsibility is as well. So whilst I'd usually conclude with a whakatauki, tonight I actually want to leave you with a well-known quote as a wero and as a reminder of the role that we each play and the impact of our work. And I'm sure many of you have heard this before, particularly those who work in the legal context. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So when we walk out of here this evening, I hope we will commit to pursuing that justice, building the Aotearoa that we want to see for an equitable, prosperous and healthy future. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. And I think Matua Dave, would you like to close us with a karakia for the evening?
Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi ngā rangatia o noho nei, mō te kaupapa tēnei rawa o tēnei pō. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this evening, and especially Nathan, Diane, and I've got a sister-in-law called Alayna. And so thank you very much for your mahi tonight, for your kaupapa. It's a very different world to what I grew up in. I grew up in the 60s, and what I see today is just astonishing, so you're doing great mahi. Inoi tātou. E o mana mātou ki roti ki tau pā e te hata mata o te atua. Aua koe whakakino ki o mātou ingo, i o mātou mate, e ngari whakarangi a mātou, ake i ngā me. Matuku katoa te takakau whakakrōreatia, whakapaingia. Āmene.
So I also need to thank you all for your efforts this evening and for your kōrero and for your challenging words to us. And hopefully we've all learned something new, or at least had our understanding of what we thought we knew broadened and challenged as well. We've got a little token of our esteem and our thanks for you each. But I'd like everybody to put their hands together again to thank our speakers this evening.